UC San Diego Center for Mindfulness, Mindfulness and Compassionate Speaker Seminar Series. Today, please help me welcome our esteemed guest, Dr. Jyoti Mishra, Assistant Professor of Psychiatry here at UCSD. She is trained in computational, cognitive, and neurosciences and the founder of the NEATS Lab, the Neural Engineering and Translational Labs at UC San Diego. She uses neurotechnologies for scalable brain health mapping, monitoring, and precision therapeutics in humans. And she's highly interdisciplinary with the intersection of digital technologies, neuroscience, and how that informs well-being. Dr. Mishra is incredibly well published. Her work, on a personal note, whenever she has a paper that comes out, I'm beyond excited because of the level of rigor and the high standards that she puts to her work. And you really can tell how well she does what she does, the way that her methods are delineated, the reproducibility, and the results of her work. She's published in the Journal of Neuroscience, Neuron numerous times, Current Biology, Journal of Cognitive Science, Translational Psychiatry. I can go on. She's worked with some great neuroscientists at UCSF, Adam Gazzaley, on attention, working memory, closed loop cognition, and digital interfaces on how that affects our well-being, as well as sensory domains, neuroscientific appreciation of sensory domains such as vision and lower and higher level cognition. She has so much work that I don't even know what you're gonna, I could see mindfulness in digital medicine, but you could have really presented on so many different other things because I've seen so many versions, so many different talks from you, Jyoti. So this is gonna be awesome. So please help me welcome Jyoti Mishra, and the floor is yours. Thank you so much for taking the time to present.
Hey, Fadila, that was amazing. I hope I can do some justice to that introduction. It's really a great pleasure to be here today presenting our work in mindfulness to all of you. When we practice the sciences that we do, it's really important for us to also think about things that really enrich our own professional and personal lives. And mindfulness is one of those things. And having the privilege to work on it within our science and to make this field more rigorous is just, I feel like such a blessing. And to work with colleagues like Fadil, who just, such great pioneers and geniuses themselves in the field. So it's amazing to be here. So today I'm going to talk about mindfulness as digital medicine and how we think about that, and how digital tech can come into play in this field. I lead the NEAT Labs, as Fadil mentioned, where we really look at neurotech for mental health. NEAT Labs is an exciting place where we have neuroscientists, engineers, clinicians coming together to really think about problems that are faced in mental health care today and how to provide engineering-based solution as well as neuroscientifically embedded solutions to care for the patients. And our labs really believe in the values for equity, diversity, and inclusion, and that's a strong component in the kinds of science that we want to lead and the individuals that we want to be, and the mentors and mentees that we want to be in the lab. A part of our work is really broad. It really looks at, single neuron spiking in animals to local field potentials in animals. That's work that's led by NEAT Labs co-director, Dakshin Ramanathan. And then in humans, obviously we do all non-invasive recordings and we relate these cross-species phenomena at the circuit level. And then in humans, we're really interested in how, the basic neurophysiological profile of the individual affects their behavior, how we can change these behaviors for the better, and how we can track neuroplasticity and how that really affects the individual at the one person level, but also at the family and community level. While, all this may sound really broad, we do have different pieces of work at all of these different, foci, and I'll try to bring that together in some of the, slides in the that I have today for you. And I don't have too many slides to present, so I do want it to be an interactive presentation. So please speak up whenever you have questions. It's harder for me to see the chat function, but if you were to just speak up and if you have a question at any time, please do, because it would make for a more exciting talk today. Okay, so I really like this picture because when we're thinking about mindfulness and about being in the present, the hardest thing is in terms of personal practice is that our mind really goes to everything else that it's not supposed to go to, or even as supposed to is actually not necessarily the best word to use here, but our mind is full of things that are beyond the present moment, beyond the focus concentration that one has on one's breath, or a clear focus of attention. Our minds are in a lot of places, and you always think about that as the analogy to the elephant in the room that's not mentioned. So I tend to like this analogy as such. And in terms of beyond the personal practice itself, we think about a lot in terms of the research challenges. One is, how do you quantify aspects around mindfulness, both in terms of behavior and neurophysiology, and mostly in terms of quantification? We think about moment to moment quantification. When is an individual attentive versus not attentive to being mindful versus not, and how do you make sure that that is quantified in the science that you do with mindfulness? How do you scale? So this is, the icons here we're really interested in work that's across the lifespan, going from children to adults to older adults. And that's, I think these practices really apply across the lifespan, but they do need to be tweaked depending on the population that we're working with. So given that, we think about challenges of scale, and we think about challenges of scale, especially when we're thinking of the populations that we work with may not be local, but they may also be in communities that are not well connected to us. So remote populations, global populations, and how do you work with them? And that's where we think about scalability. And in terms of scalability, conventional practices that require teachers to be present at all times for didactic sessions, and trained teachers. So then there's variability in these teachings as well that would come into play when we're thinking about quantification and scale. And then we think about personalization, and personalization really means engagement. And this is something we think about in the School of Medicine a lot, especially the Institute of Empathy and Compassion here has been interested in this topic from the point of application to healthcare physicians and medical students, and essentially, the productive workforce that's really busy and, may even have 30 seconds to be mindful, maybe in the moments right before they enter their practice with their patients, but not more than that, or not more time that they're willing to give to that. And then there's people who are willing to practice for much longer periods of time, engaging in long retreat sessions over multiple days where there's continuous practice over the entire day, and so on. So how do you think about, quantifying how much a person should do, could do, and how they can integrate these practices that may be beneficial for their well-being states? So and then eventually, data-driven is part of all of these aspects. And that's where I'll talk about how we can leverage some of the digital tools we have to make things more amenable for research as such. So in this case, Fado mentioned when I was at UCSF, I was working on aspects of closed loop design. And I think we need a mic check, but I think someone has their keyboard going. But it's when we think about closed loop design, we have an individual who is engaging in the mindful practice. And in this case, for the purposes of this talk, let's think about a digital application, an app that they're constantly engaging with during the practice. And why that is helpful is that when we design such a framework, which is in a loop, what you get are three basic elements that become the tenets of how closed loop design must be for this app to work. So here, we're any kind of practice requires repetition to get to perfection. When we apply aspects of digital design, you are also able to provide feedback to the individual about how well they're doing, depending on whatever the app might be monitoring in terms of feedback from the individual about how distracted they are, or how how attentive to their breath they are, and so on. So these are behavioral elements that one puts into these apps, and I'll go into the details of that. And then the app receives feedback from the app provides feedback to the individual on a continuous basis. So sometimes this external feedback is nice to have to start off a practice that is somewhat ambiguous, in that, am I really doing what I'm doing? Am I doing this right? In terms of this, a little bit of hand holding, so to say, that sometimes teachers do as well in the very beginning baby steps sessions, this digital feedback tends to play a role in that as well. And then one of the things that I found really fascinating about closed loop design is when it's applied to meditative practices is the ideas around adaptivity. And adaptivity essentially means challenging individuals for the time that they are performing at good capacity. So for example, say you're a runner, and you want to get to running a marathon, then and you've never ran in your life, you're not going to start with a 20-mile run. You're going to start with a mile-long run. And so should it be a 30-minute meditation session from the get-go, or could it be built into much shorter time segments? Could you start with 1 minute time segments of practice and so on, and then gradually build up to more efficacious time segments? So these are also ideas we worked around in terms of adaptivity, and these principles actually, theoretically, they were one of my other mentors, Michael Merznick, who's really a stalwart in the field of brain plasticity. These principles are actually very applicable to the field of brain plasticity as well, because both animal work and work in humans has shown that these principles tend to bring together circuits more strongly. And you can see changes at the circuit and synaptic level when interventions are designed with these specific principles of closed loop design around repetition, feedback, and adaptive learning. So these are sort of theoretical concepts. Let me give you some examples from the work that has come out of this. So these are a kind of digital meditation practice that was developed up at UCSF, and I'll describe this. There's more we've done with these kinds of practices out here at UCSD as well. So in this example, the way the app setup is applied is that it's actually really simple. The individual interacts with an app that asks it to pay attention to the breath. So which is a very basic practice that one can do, is have an internal anchor. The basic requirement is that the anchor is internal and as opposed to external. So in this case, your breath, and you are just paying attention to the breath, and it starts with very small doses, 10-second segments. And after every 10 seconds in this particular type of design, there were probes where you're asked, there's a little chime that comes up that asks whether, did you feel distracted in that segment or not? And it's a behavioral probe that individuals respond to. One can see that this kind of probing can also be integrated with physiological responses, which is something that we're working on out here as well. But all it does is that it builds on these individual responses of whether people felt that they were distracted or not, and considering that these are true responses, the app adaptively provides longer and longer segments in which an individual must pay attention to their breath. So from 10 seconds to the next, if they're doing well, to 12, 14, 16 seconds, and so on, and eventually building on to minutes long segments. And so this particular app design was really probing very continuously whether the individuals were paying valid attention. And in this work, I'm going to describe to you the kinds of, how we bring in the research practice to it. Many of you have done this kind of work, such as a randomized control trial design study. And I'll explain the different components of it if you're new to an RCT type design. And the title also says double-blind cluster randomized. So I'm going to describe to you the work in children, which is what I led. And these were actually neglected children. So this is work that I was able to lead in India with foster children, which was really very much a privilege to work with this organization out there. And this is also part of the scalability of the digital solution, and the testing interface allowed me to extend the work beyond our local community setting. So in this sort of RCT design, you have the main intervention that you want to test, which is group 1 here. And I call it the internal attention intervention because we're paying attention to the breath. The digital meditation was meant to have the children pay attention to the breath over. I'll go into the durations as well in a minute. And then we have other groups that form the randomized control structure, which is, what do you compare this to? So very naturally, an active control that comes to mind is that if you, instead of paying attention internally, what if one were to pay attention externally? And so for this purpose, we used cognitive training modules, which are about training attention to items that come up on a screen, and you're paying attention to some items, and then there are other items that are distracting that you're not paying attention to. And the focus, though, here is just fully external, and it's it's actively matched in terms of time that the participants take in one or the other arm. And then we also had a no intervention control in this case. Before and after the intervention, we're also looking at neuroimaging metrics, cognitive metrics in the children, and also behavior. I'll get into a minute about behaviors and why we really look at ADHD behaviors. But these particular assessments come prior to the intervention stage, and then there's a post-training assessment stage, which includes the original assessments. And then given the funding that we had, we were also able to do a 1-year follow-up in terms of the behaviors of the children that went through this trial. So a couple other things, the way this particular trial was structured was around 6 weeks, 20 minutes per session, and about 15 total hours. So in a given week, the children were participating for 20-minute sessions, maybe 3 to 5 days a week, and completing the sessions in about 6 weeks' time. And what we were really excited to see that both arms, group 1 and 2, really had 100% adherence to their intervention. So this is something we've worked on in these sort of closed loop design mechanics, is that the feedback and the scores and the leaderboards, they're really part of regular games that incentivize individuals, can sometimes also help people take on practices that are not necessarily about external motivating environments, but also internally motivating environments. Um, and anecdotally as well, I think the organizations that we worked with were very interested in how we were able to achieve this full engagement when some other ways in which the children had been put into, say, a mindfulness class, or otherwise they weren't able to attend them to full capacity. And so that speaks a little bit to the kind of platform leveraging that one can do in these kinds of studies. The other thing I mentioned that I would go back to is the concepts around ADHD. And this is, I got interested in work. It's sort of indirect that I was interested. My training was in studies around attention, and which led me to work in children with ADHD. And it turns out that children who've had a background of poor childhood upbringing in terms of neglect and household dysfunction, and those children at the time of adolescence, so this is a 9 to 15 year broad age range, around this time, they are reflecting a lot of behaviors that are symptomatic of ADHD, but they're actually neglect, they're sort of symptoms of the neglect that they have had in their early life cycle. So especially in the field of when we think about trauma impacted care for children, this is very well known that these children will tend to have behaviors that are ADHD like, and we've gone on to show more about that work in other research we've done that I'm not going to talk about today as well. But in this population, ADHD behaviors were really relevant. So and really, another thing I would like to mention here is that the group 2 external attention, it's not some kind of a passive group in that we did not think that they'd have benefit. These are actually games that individuals create and even prescribe. We have games such as these are now actually prescriptive for ADHD. So it's not that we've taken something that we thought would not work. So going at the outset, it wasn't really very clear whether the internal attention arm would have stronger benefits or not, although that's what we would hypothesize from our study. It was, the study was done to really show that kind of outcome. So this is, these were results which are actually, some of the stronger results I've seen in my scientific work in terms of how clear the findings were. So this is looking at functional brain connectivity changes that happen post versus baseline, and these were looking at fMRI-based imaging in these children during resting state, and these are very canonical brain networks that are involved in the regulation of sustained attention. And it's essentially what's on the right is shown the network that we have, which is the dorsal anterior cingulate, and the insula network are the core hubs of the specific sustained attention network. And you see that the internal attention with the arm that went through the digital meditation has an increase in connectivity in these networks, while the other two arms aren't able to show these outcomes at the end of the trial. And this is data from David Ziegler, who did this work in adults. So these are just healthy adults that were recruited at UCSF, showing again that the neural activity changes, in this case, they were measured with EEG data, showing with the focus around medial frontal cortex, the same regions, these DACC-like regions. He's showing similar results in adults as well, with improvements in the sort of, in this case, he's not looking at functional connectivity, he's looking at phase locking that occurs in the EEG space, which is sort of this parallel to the functional connectivity we would look at in fMRI space. And then they also had an active control training in the adult study as well. And so in both children and adults, we saw these parallel findings in terms of the brain networks that were getting involved in these networks, involved in this kind of intervention. Okay, so in this field, we also think a lot about cognitive transfer. So cognitive transfer really means like what would it mean to do this kind of digital type of meditation? Would it really affect other behaviors? But in this case, these are objective assays of cognition where you can control the kinds of stimuli that you get. So there's an assay that one has for sustained attention. It's actually a very boring assay where you have to detect a certain type of visual target amongst a lot of distractors, and you just have to keep doing this for a long period of time. So it's about a 20-minute assessment, and but as a very boring task. But essentially, it looks at how consistently you can sustain attention to the target, and that's also used as a test for ADHD in children. And so there's positive Z-score improvement for the sustained attention outcome. And then another test that was really relevant to the opposite side of the coin is like, can you process distractors better? Can you suppress them better? If you could increase the focus on what you're paying attention to, but can you also process distractors at the same time? And a similar pattern in this case as well. It's also interesting that the two other arms, the orange and the gray arm, actually show impacted performance at post versus pre-training. And this could be because this test tends to be a little bit of a, like I said, a boring test that kids have a tough time engaging in as such. So their internal motivation to go through such testing can be poor, and that's why we see even reduced performance at post. Okay, and then this is just a correlational graph relating the changes that we see in brain circuits with the changes that we see in cognition. In terms of outcomes were quite related. So showing that these are really associated changes happening in the individuals going through the training. Interestingly, again, the same pattern in terms of the ADHD behaviors. And this was at post. And what was exciting was that the result actually kept improving, and it was a 1-year follow-up. We see a similar kind of pattern. Now, at the 1-year follow-up, in this interim 1-year period, we've not actually given the children the ability to practice on the app. They don't really have access to it. But if you do post qualitative interviews of how children took to the practice, is that you really develop a more of an internal skill to use this constant attention to breath whenever you need to in your life practice, whenever the need arises. It's not that we told them that when you're in a stressful situation, move back to this attention to breath practice. But that's how anecdotally the children said that they took that on in the interim year. So in future work, we want to, be able to track that more precisely through journal logs and so on, to see how participants use such practice even after, say, the digital element is taken away. So it's not that I'm promoting the digital piece to be to use this fancy app or whatnot. It's more that it's a ways to bring in a practice. It's a ways for us to measure how individuals can engage in meditation, how they do this over time. But it's not the end all. The end all is to have this be a sustainable solution in the person's life, that they can learn internal regulation and get to it whenever the need arises. I mean, usually it's the more constant the practice is on a day-to-day basis, the better it is. But that is something we want to be able to track further in future work. But these were assessments that were 1 year apart. Okay, so there's some pictures from our trial, and and really fun working with these children, and we hope to continue future work with them as well. I'm gonna just switch back a little bit about the stuff that I've been talking about is thinking about how the digital tools help us to quantify better, how to scale in some ways to populations that we wouldn't have had access to otherwise, or resources to go and work with otherwise. So the next part of the segments that I'm really gonna sort of go over, and these are work in progress, is how do we think about personalization in this context of digital meditation. And when I think about personalization, at UCSD, when I came here, we've been doing a lot of work with mood disorders, especially, depression and anxiety related disorders, because it's pretty much every fourth or fifth person that we see has high depression and anxiety symptoms when individuals come into the lab. So we can't really even ignore that situation at all. And this is just recruiting from the general population. We're not even recruiting from a clinic as such. And the depression related disorders are highly comorbid with the anxiety related disorders. And it's there's an opportunity here, because the first line of treatment that exists, which is antidepressant medications and anxiolytics, are only about 30% effective. That is, the rest of the patients tend to remit, tend to not remit. The problem is refractory. The problem keeps coming back over and over again. So the symptoms may go away for some period of time with the meds, but they don't really resolve on a more substantial level. And so in this context, obviously, there's a large clinical neuroscience and clinical treatment community working on mood disorder related therapeutics. So when we think about mindfulness in this context, we want to think about it embedded with all the treatments that exist and all that an individual is going through. So when we focus on the patient, mindfulness is one aspect, while there's also other aspects of that person's lifestyle that I haven't even touched upon in the previous part of the talk, which are how they sleep, how they eat, how they exercise, how their cardiac health is, and so on. And how do you embed all of these elements, or think about these elements in terms of personalizing a solution for the patient that might work for them. And so this is the work we really are excited about. And I got to thinking about these multiple strategies because, if you actually look for trials in depression, there's an RCT for sleep therapy and physical exercise therapy and so on. Along with those for antidepressants, there's also diet related therapies that work on reducing the content of processed fats and sugars and so on. So how does all this really fit together with being more mindful? So this is work we're collaborating on with the School of Engineering, and in this case, we're really saying, okay, well, I want to know more about you as a person. When you tell me that you are feeling, sad or depressed, and meeting the criteria for clinical depression. And so we say, okay, we're going to do a 30-day study, and about a 1-month study is what we've done with these individuals. They've been the patients have been very compliant, which has been great. I'll just tell you a little bit more about it, in that we monitor their clinical mental health, which is just the subjective skills that are available in the clinic. We also have brain and cognitive function assessments that we do with certain neurocognitive mapping tools that we've developed in the lab. So people who are more interested in that can look at our most recent papers from 2021, where we really created scalable brain mapping platforms that we use in local as well as remote communities. And that's been really exciting, but I'm not going to go into too much about the details of those platforms by themselves, because the focus of this talk is more around the mindfulness elements. And then we say, so these are these are in this sort of icon of a camera. These are snapshot assessments, which means that we do them at the beginning when the patients come in, we do them at the end, which is at the end of the 30-day period, and we also do them in the middle. And same with the brain and cognitive function assessments, as we have an EEG cap that they put on, and they do these assessments at these 3 snapshot time points. Then we say, okay, well, let's just continuously monitor these other aspects, for which aspects of attentive breathing. So we created a very short digital assessment of attentive breathing. In this, you only engage for about 30 seconds. And all you do is, for about 30 seconds, pay attention to your breath. And after a full cycle of inhale plus exhale, just tap your screen. And what we're monitoring is how consistently you're doing this. And it's a very simple, very short 30-second assessment of paying attention to the breath. And along with that, there's lifestyle monitoring and diet monitoring and mood tracking. And this is happening over a 30-day period. About 3 to 4 times a day is when the individual is engaging with this. And so you imagine that you get a lot of data at the end of that. And why we need all of this data is that we're really considering N-of-1 models in this case. And this is not that we're interested in, we are eventually interested in getting data from many patients and impacting or helping many patients with their depressed mood. But the objective here really is personalized modeling, that you take the fluctuations in mood and depressed mood that are happening for that individual on a daily basis, and how is that related to these other predictors that we have for them that are outlined up here, from the clinical markers to the breathing markers to the lifestyle markers and diet markers and so on. So all of this goes into the N-of-1 model platform. And eventually where we want to get to with this is to provide a closed loop solution that has the sensitive elements built in for that individual. Okay, so it's a very talented young student, Rutvik, worked on this and created a really comprehensive pipeline. It's not easy to do this kind of work because he was able to align many different kinds of data coming in from many different kinds of sources. And pictorially, he was able to use a machine learning pipeline that uses many different algorithms to really get at the best model for each person. And here is, data as an example from one person up on the right here, where there's actual data, actual fluctuations in the depressed state, and then predicted fluctuations in the depressed state. And it's not 100% predictive, but there is a very high correlation between the actual and predicted state, and we're able to predict it with very low percentage error. And our goals here again are not really about, can we predict the depressed state? We already know that the person is depressed, so it's not really more about prediction. It's more about what can we do to help the individual. In this particular example that I take, participant 10, P10, we are looking at the top 5 features from their personalized model. And what turns up from the many things that we input into the model are that the highest predictors for this person are their states of anxiety, their breathing time on this 30-second assessment that they do on a repeated level. There's also sleep duration, so there's excess sleep in this case, aspects of past day sugars, and breathing variability, which is also part of this attentive breathing assessment that we do. So you can imagine that we can come up with these metrics for every particular patient in the trial. And then we say, okay, how can we design or deploy a timed digital breathing module, digital meditation module for that person, which may also be instructive along with other aspects that need to be tweaked for this person. Say, for example, reducing the sleep hours in this case. So the goal here is not just prediction from the ML models, but using the explanatory features from those models to develop a better intervention for each patient. So, now I'm just going to get through to some of the new work that we're excited about, that we're going to get to most of this year, launching these trials. And this is work that's generously funded by the Sanford Institute and also for the Hope for Depression Foundation. And so in this arm is what I just showed you, is like we actually built this capacity for NF1 personalized modeling of data that we get from multiple sources and wearables and apps for each individual, and how to use that for a closed loop treatment. We're not just using this for patients, but also applying this within our medical community, because in some ways we think about mental well-being on a continuum. It is not that you have to pass a certain threshold to be, clinically depressed. Even our most, our own most productive days can have stress and poor mental well-being built into them. So how does it help us working professionals as well? And this is an ongoing study that we're conducting as of now with our medical school partners. The second study that that is ongoing is that we're trying to see, well, how can we neurobiologically improve the impacts of such sort of treatment, to say, from practice of digital meditation. So for example, this second study pairs this a digital meditation with a transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is an FDA approved therapy for treatment refractory depression. So serious patients who it's not their first time, but they've had episodes where they failed antidepressants, and those are individuals who enroll in this trial. TMS is an FDA approved therapy, but again has about a 30% remission rate. So how can we improve that? In this case, we now have a study with more than 300 adults doing this attention to breath task, this very short attention to breath task that I talked about, showing that increased sense of mindfulness is on this attention to breath task is related to greater activation of the DLPFC. And this DLPFC site is its dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. For those of you who are not neuroscientists, it's really relevant because it's a brain site that is very important for executive control, and is the same brain site that's used in depression for TMS stimulation. So thinking about recruiting the same brain area that is important and activated during mindfulness and is also stimulated during this depression treatment, will that bring more sustainable gains is what we're after. And finally, sort of the work that we continue to do with children, where while we think about neglected children, we also think about, children in our homes and living with their families. This is, again, pilot work that's funded by the Sanford Institute, where we've modified those modules to have sort of a co-play element between a parent and child. And how do we, build sort of this bonding between not just, an individual practicing this, taking on this practice, but practicing as with the partner, in this case, a family member. And this is, it also, I think, helps to sustain the practice to have this social connection built in. And this, again, we're testing in children who've shown signs of depression and anxiety. And again, there's elements of this trial that can be remote, so can be run on a national level. And there are elements that we're doing locally for the brain recordings. It's highly relevant to any age here. So this is my family doing this practice where kids, my little one's 3 years old. She's doing the practice at tracking every breath. So she taps her dad's lap every breath. The older child is at a higher level, tapping every 4 breaths or so on. And so essentially, this is thinking about how we make this into a practice that's good for the self, but also for the family as they're engaging in it. Okay. And so the very last thing, sort of knitting back to, the broader goals. When we think about our labs, we're thinking about neurons, we're thinking about circuits, individual, a component of the family that I can't go into too many details on, but emotional and family support is really part of the integration of the personalized solutions that we think of for people who are suffering from, poor mental well-being. But then there's also, the very much larger element is the aspects around community. And this is work that we've led in Northern California, in communities that are impacted by really accelerated climate change driven wildfires that we see every year. And this is work that we just published out of this data set that we collected in 2019, in that this sample was collected right after the Camp Fire, which happened to be is still the deadliest fire that happened in California, because of where the epicenter was in this small town called Paradise that had bottlenecks in terms of how the roads that led out of Paradise were really blocked and people couldn't get out. And it was just a very sad situation. And people were chronically impacted. So we are looking at aspects of depression and anxiety 6 months out after the fires, and we still see a really large sample that is impacted. And so what I want to stress here is that we're in this large sample, we're measuring, again, many dimensions of individual identity and behaviors. So from their age, their gender, their ethnicities, their socioeconomic status, and whether they were directly exposed to the fires or indirectly exposed or not exposed. We had a control sample out here at San Diego that was part of this work. So there were individuals who were equally not exposed versus directly or indirectly exposed. Childhood trauma, I've talked about that a little bit in terms of the neglect one has had before. Essentially, what we're modeling here is trying to understand the depression and anxiety in individuals who have been impacted by these fires, by all of these different variables that that could be predictors of where their depression or anxiety is at. And what is striking here, to me at least, is mindfulness, how strong. So these are standardized predictors. So one unit change in mindfulness is one unit change in depression. And essentially one of the strongest predictors that is protective against the depression and anxiety symptoms is this a subjective level of mindfulness that the individual has. And this is not something that, I went out to look for. Oh, mindfulness will definitely come up here, but primed from our work, we knew that this was important to measure. It just became the most prominent predictor of protection against these disorders. Was just very much something that we see as important to scale the kinds of tools that mindfulness can provide, that whether it's digital or otherwise, that these kinds of practices need to be taken further to protect from the stressors that are in our environment on a daily basis. Okay, so I actually don't have more to present, and so I hope I've talked a little bit about these different aspects. And ultimately, where with our Neat Labs is really about translational work. So we think about greater efficacy, and how we build that through digital and integration is one of the ways we've worked our way through this field. And yeah, so just thank you for listening. And I'm happy to take questions. I think we have some time for that.